Do you know what it means to have a revolution? And what it takes to make a solution?
My name is Ryan Jobson. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Chicago. And I just want to say, good afternoon from Chicago, good evening to those of you who are tuning in from across the pond, as we say. And I'm going to try to keep my comments fairly brief here today, but I do want to thank Amanda for the invitation to participate in this conversation, as well as just the opportunity to think alongside many friends and comrades, even if only virtually for the time being. And I did also want to thank Lloyd in particular for his comments. It's a topic that's very close to me. My father's from St. Elizabeth, Jamaica. My grandfather worked for Reynolds Mines. My great uncle worked for Alcan as a chemical engineer. So I'm very familiar with both the conflict and in that part of Jamaica, as well as the long history of extractivism that I guess sparked a lot of my research interests that principally are focused on oil and gas politics and labor insurgency in Trinidad and Tobago. But I've also written several commentaries on the situation in Guyana since the discovery of offshore oil by ExxonMobil. So I'm going to try to bridge a number of those topics here today. As an anthropologist, my research is usually focused on the ethnographic nuances and social worlds of extraction in the Caribbean. But I actually want to begin today with what we might call a bird's eye view, so to speak, of the new extractivisms in the Americas through what I'm calling a brief biography of a single drill ship called the Deepwater Champion that's unfolded over the past 10 years. So the biography of the Deepwater Champion actually begins at the Hyundai Heavy Industries shipyard in Ulsan, South Korea. It's commissioned by the Texas-founded and Switzerland-based contractor Transocean in 2010 at a cost of $740 million US. And the 6th-generation ultra-deepwater drill ship was outfitted with 2 rig stations equipped to drill simultaneously to subterranean depths of 40,000 feet and in up to 12,000 feet of water. Prized for their mobility enabled by autonomous propulsion systems, drill ships like the Deepwater Champion travel expediently from one drill site to the next without the aid of an independent towing vessel, which is typical of traditional semi-submersible drilling rigs. Initially leased to ExxonMobil for offshore operations in Turkey, the drill ship completed its maiden voyage from Ulsan after it passed through the Bosphorus Strait in Istanbul. After this pilot drilling program, it crossed into the territorial waters of Romania for another venture in the Black Sea. And after this venture in Romania, it ventured across the Atlantic to the US Gulf of Mexico, where it began a 3-year contract in June 2012 until it was prematurely pulled from the Gulf to spud an exploratory well in Guyana in 2015. So drilling, of course, proceeded despite the competing territorial claims at the time by the neighboring Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. And now what we know as the resulting Liza-1 well generated the first major offshore oil discovery in Guyana with a productive potential in excess of 700 million barrels of crude oil equivalent. So I recount all of this, not just as a sort of novelty, but also to map the context behind the new extractivisms in the Caribbean, the sort of technological and geographic changes, and also to remind us that the landscape of extractivism in the Caribbean is never disconnected from these other extractive and industrial geographies that link us to the Black Sea, to the Mediterranean, to the Gulf of Mexico, to South Korea, for instance. So emboldened by a global boom in deepwater oil and gas production, the Deepwater Champion garnered a reputation for its record of commercial success and efficiency. Named the Rig of the Year by Transocean's European and African unit, the drill ship appeared still in the opening acts of its productive career. The drilling bonanza fueled corporate enthusiasm in deepwater oil and gas futures. For ExxonMobil, the deepwater constituted a chief area of expansion in a broader portfolio of unconventional oil and gas production. Alongside the extractive innovations of North American shale and Canadian tar sands, the mantra of going deeper ensured that new reserves would be unlocked in perpetuity, or so it seemed. In 2014, ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson projected that worldwide deepwater production would grow 150% by 2040. Spurred by advances in extractive technologies and techniques, unconventional oil and gas ushered in an era of fossil fuel abundance, less encumbered seemingly by the perils of peak oil. And in 2014, Tillerson heralded North America as the new center of oil and gas production in the 21st century, citing 3 frontier areas: Canadian tar sands, US tight oil and shale gas, and deepwater plays in the circum-Atlantic. For the first half decade of its productive life, from 2010 to 2015, the deepwater champion didn't concern itself with whether another frontier would emerge. Rather than a question of if this frontier would present itself, it remained simply where and when it would be deployed to next. During its productive life, the deepwater champion exploited the commercial viability of deepwater ventures with reckless abandon. The 2010 Deepwater Horizon blowout in the Gulf of Mexico notwithstanding, the commercial prospects of oil and gas continued to attract investors even after the US government responded with certain restrictions on deepwater drilling. As deepwater exploration and production boomed elsewhere in the Brazilian pre-salt and the West African offshore, for instance, the future of this particular drill ship appeared especially bright. But of course, this boom didn't last. In the latter months of 2014, which is when I actually arrived in Trinidad for the bulk of my field research, spot prices for oil and natural gas dropped precipitously as the combined production of Saudi crude and US tight oil resulted in a worldwide glut in oil supplies. This is euphemized by The Economist as a geopolitical skirmish of sheikhs versus shale, in which the US effectively toppled Saudi Arabia as the swing producer at that moment, capable of setting the oil markets. The price of oil dropped below $27 a barrel in January 2016, which is its lowest level since May 2003, and a 75% drop from its previous peak of nearly $108 a barrel in June 2014. So for the deepwater champion, this market downturn inaugurated a moment of uncertainty. After the Guyana exploration venture in 2015, Transocean failed to secure a contract for its juggernaut drillship. Gambling instead on a long-term market recovery and a renaissance in deepwater investments, Transocean opted for a novel strategy of cold stacking, in which it powered down its drillships, emptied them of their crews, and indefinitely parked them offshore. This is distinct from a more common practice of warm stacking, as they call it in the industry, in which drill ships are kept running by a minimal staff in between contracts and drill sites. But cold stacking served as a cost-saving measure for Transocean to weather the adverse market tides. In the immediate term, the strategy succeeded by assuring its shareholders that the companies would successfully kill time and minimize losses ahead of an eventual and expected market recovery. Even as Transocean removed a growing number of drill ships from service, the company reported profits of $77 million US in the second quarter of 2016, which prompted an 8.5% spike in stock value. Although it reassured shareholders, cold stacking posed a number of risks to the long-term viability of Transocean's drillship fleet. So long as deepwater investments flourished, drill ships such as the Deepwater Champion had never been shut off. As one Transocean electrician had put it, these drill ships were not designed to sit idle. More to the point, to this day, it remains unclear what will happen if and when these cold stacked drill ships are returned to operation. To power them back up requires a massive team of engineers to reprogram thousands of drilling presets, and this has never been previously attempted. There was never any occasion to do this before. In straightforward terms, as the byline of one energy newspaper queried, what happens when they try to turn them back on? The cold stack gamble, therefore, is twofold. One, it's a gamble on the recovery of oil and gas markets that I think Melinda has shown should not be the expectation, particularly now in 2020. And secondly, it's a gamble on whether the capital that's frozen in these cold stack drill ships can be successfully brought on stream. So the final chapter in the saga of the Deepwater Champion occurred in 2016, when it made its final journey to join Transocean's fleet of mothballed drill ships in the Gulf of Paria off the west coast of Trinidad. So a Bloomberg news brief described the scene as follows, and I quote, "In a far corner of the Caribbean Sea, one of those idyllic spots touched most days by little more than fishermen chasing blue marlin, billions of dollars of the world's finest oil equipment bobs quietly in the water. Commoditizing its comparatively calm waters, outside of the hurricane belt as an offshore storage unit, The government of Trinidad and Tobago provided Transocean with offshore parking, in effect, at the minimal cost of $8,000 US per ship per day. So I rehearsed this fairly exhaustive narrative for several reasons. First, I want to sit with the phenomenon of cold stacking as an instructive metaphor for the current landscape of global oil and gas operations, and as well the political imaginary associated with the petrostate, which seems to be taking hold in Guyana as it has in Trinidad for many, many decades. As we're all quite familiar, oil and gas markets find themselves in the midst of a protracted bear market, spurred in the first instance by the shale boom in 2014 and exacerbated recently by the COVID-19 pandemic that drastically reduced demand for fossil fuels and briefly turned spot prices for North American crude oil negative in April 2020. That essentially you had companies that were paying people to take oil off their hands because there was such a lack of available storage. In effect, both oil and gas multinationals and oil exporting states have placed their operations on ice, so to speak, anticipating a much longer than expected road to a market recovery. In Trinidad, the accumulation of cold stacked rigs in its offshore waters sits at odds with a model of statecraft that remains dependent on oil and gas rents and revenues, but has failed to reverse both a decade-long decline in crude oil production, which now rests at historic lows, decades-long lows in Trinidad, or to resolve a persistent shortfall in natural gas feedstock that's used in its petrochemical industries that's led to the shuttering of several industrial facilities at its storied, or perhaps sometimes infamous Point Lisas industrial estate. In Guyana, production from its landmark offshore fields by ExxonMobil continues despite the decline in crude markets, as Melinda suggested earlier. But the current market landscape has thrown cold water on the expected windfall that inspired hyperbolic projections several years ago that each Guyanese will be a US dollar millionaire or worth that in a few years. In addition to the meager 2% royalty on all crude oil sales that's extended to the government of Guyana under the product sharing agreement with Exxon, the agreement also permits the oil major to recoup its operational costs from oil sales, capped at 75% of total monthly production. Not only are provisions of this sort notoriously susceptible to gold plating, which is a practice in which reported costs of operations are deliberately inflated to maximize corporate profits, but needless to say, it's negatively impacted the revenues enjoyed by the Guyanese state as the profit margins per barrel shrink considerably. Both Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana represent distinct iterations of what I'm calling here unconventional sovereignties, in the sense that their political and economic futures are increasingly staked to these unconventional extractivisms. But I'm also posing this phrase in a much more cheeky fashion to ask, to what extent such unconventional sovereignties can be deemed sovereignty at all when the lives of ordinary citizens and working people remain beholden to the whims of enterprising statesmen and the fluctuations of global commodity markets. So rather than a departure from prior experiments in Caribbean resource nationalism and post-colonial sovereignty, like the example of bauxite in Jamaica and Guyana or oil and gas in Trinidad, this moment of cold stacking reveals the extent to which oil cannot be regarded as a sort of source of a magical windfall to finance either clientelist patronage politics or limited state-directed social welfare programs. Another lesson we derive from the biography of the Deepwater Champion relates to the theme of this conversation on the resistance to such new extractivisms in the Caribbean. So while in Trinidad, there's a storied history of labor insurgency in the oil and gas sector, beginning with the general strike of 1937, it's worth emphasizing that the geographies of extraction and also of resistance have shifted markedly with the turn from onshore and conventional drilling to these offshore and deepwater frontiers. So an examination of the technical properties of the Deepwater Champion really sheds greater light on this new status quo. These drill ships are differentiated from other offshore drilling units by their easy mobility and ability to function independent of external transport vessels. So the ease at which these extractive infrastructures traverse across sovereign territories that the kind of biography reveals poses new possibilities for the exploitation of fossil fuels, by privileging expediency and mobility over the stability of infrastructure and the mitigation of risk. Effectively, multinationals like ExxonMobil exploit the sovereign borders, like the contested maritime border between Venezuela and Guyana, for instance, as little more than special economic zones that they use to negotiate favorable terms and circumvent less favorable commercial and tax regimes. So in other words, what I'm proposing here is that resistance to the new extractivism will necessarily have to contend with the new technological and market landscape of oil and gas in the Caribbean. 2020 is not 1975 or 1937. Rather than prescribing the shape or character of what this resistance might take, I actually want to pose this more as an open question that perhaps we can delve into in Q&A. What I will underscore, though, is that resistance must necessarily move beyond instrumental claims to a greater piece of the action, to invoke the great Calypsonian Black Stalin, through a renegotiation of product sharing contracts that afford regional states a greater share of profits. As my fellow panelist Matthew Quest and I observed in a recent commentary on US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's diplomatic visit to Suriname and Guyana in September, the limited horizon of demands for more expedient fiscal terms, for sort of a greater share of the profits to be accumulated by the state, takes for granted the progressive nature of post-colonial governments in the region. To put it differently, the demand can't simply be for the state to assume its greater share of the extractive largesse, or to enact a more just, seemingly, balance of payments between multinational corporations and elite post-colonial statesmen. On Pompeo's visit to Guyana, Matthew and I asked, and I quote, what's being subverted in the region? National sovereignty or workers' self-emancipation? Similarly, as we chart this new horizon of resistance, we have to ask ourselves whether the ends of this resistance are focused on the restoration of these unconventional sovereignties under the banner of rentier state capital, or whether they actually point us toward a genuine practice of economic democracy and workers' self-management, guided by principles of direct democracy and social ecology, or what Matthew has called a Caribbean Federation from below. So I might actually conclude here, because I know Matthew is going to pick up a number of these threads in his comments after the first round of Q&A. So I'll simply end by sort of insisting on the necessity of building a resistance that's guided by multiracial and multilingual regional solidarity, rather than sort of insular national chauvinism or extractive resource nationalism. So to speak of what I'm calling unconventional sovereignties, as I have here, is to consider the limits of the nation state project in the region that permits multinational capital to exploit sovereign countries as special economic zones, and really at the expense of the masses of Caribbean working people. As Lloyd said, we need a movement in Jamaica. The same can be said for the rest of the region. But I'll add that in my estimation, this is doomed to fail if the movements are placed in service of individual or atomized sovereignties and nation state projects. We need to think in regional terms. We need to think in global terms about the various geographies that are implicated, again, in these new extractivisms. So what is the horizon of this resistance? The focus on Guyana as the latest theater of this standoff with North Atlantic capital, by necessity must involve mobilizing ordinary people to reject all sides of the, quote unquote, oil war between nation states over paltry extractive rents and royalties. When Matthew and I published our commentary in Guyana in the Alyssa Trotz's In the Diaspora column, we were criticized by some for our relentless idealism on this front, that we insisted on a political horizon that extends beyond the nation state and beyond parliamentary governance. Yet I think we should remind ourselves that the nation state project in the Caribbean is barely 50 years old, and it shouldn't be treated as a natural or inevitable model of political organization. It certainly wasn't in the early 60s when many other proposals were on the table, and various versions of the Federation project were on the table. So following the lessons of the great C.L.R. James, I'll just conclude by saying that the ideal of a regional federation from below will also require the vast sort of cultural and political energies to chart a new course for the Caribbean political imagination. And this is the work ahead. So I'll leave it there for now, and thank you all again.